The Apple eMac is an iconic computer for many. With its recognizable white plastic shell and CRT screen, these were all over the place in the early 2000s classrooms and tech labs.
Now here's a funky
Apple launched the eMac in 2002 as a way to provide the education market with a budget G4 machine, and came with SDR RAM and 1.1 USB ports. However, its later revision in early 2003 came with USB 2.0 ports and DDR RAM, which enhanced its performance. And throughout its lifetime, you could eventually get an eMac with a 1.46 GHz G4 processor, which was pretty fast. Inside of this eMac is a 1 GHz PowerPC G4 processor, a full gigabyte of RAM, and a 32 MB ATI Radeon graphics card. In addition, there was an option for airport wireless cards on these eMacs, which my eMac does have. And those stereo speakers up front, they actually sound pretty decent if a bit quiet. Take a listen. And all this power is being fed to a gorgeous 17-inch Sony CRT on the front. And the reason this has a CRT is because in the 2000s, LCDs were still very expensive. And although Apple had already implemented LCDs onto their regular Power Mac G4s, these were meant to be a less expensive option, and LCDs were very expensive. This CRT is pretty unique though, seeing that this computer is the last Mac to ever use a CRT, and also that this is a flat CRT which uses a lot more glass, but it does mean that it's a lot more durable against kids trying to punch it and stuff. The one disadvantage to a CRT is that this thing was very big and very heavy, weighing 50 pounds, making this a pain to bring around schools and, for me, to bring home. And although this may not have the handle on the front like the iMac G3 had, the shape actually is relatively grippable, which is a good thing. Because speaking of the whole shape of this machine, this has a pretty iconic look, with its spaceship-like egg form factor. On the back you had a little bit of translucent plastic for airflow, and not a whole lot else. On the front though, you have two stereo speakers, your DVD drive, your screen, and also a small microphone on the top left. And on the top where a webcam might normally be, you have the words eMac stamped on. Despite the eMac only coming in one design and color though, I think this is still a pretty cool design, having this shiny Apple logo on the front and a pretty clean looking tray loading DVD drive. And on the sides of the machine, all you see are some little metal screws, but on the bottom you do have a door where you can unscrew the regular Phillips screwdriver to upgrade the RAM, which I've done to upgrade it to its maximum of 1 GB, although it does say that there's 2 GB, but I've heard that it could only really take advantage of 1. On the right side of the machine, you have a handful of I/O, including 2 audio jacks, 3 USB ports, which were initially only 1.1 compatible, but on this version they're 2.0. In addition, you have FireWire, Ethernet, and Mini VGA, although the Mini VGA port only works for cloning the display. And some things that you'd probably be plugging into those USB ports would be a keyboard and a mouse. And in about 2000 to 2003, when these were released, the standard Apple keyboard and mouse looked like this. And to be honest, the Pro Mouse I'm not the biggest fan of, but this keyboard is honestly pretty decent even today. They're ideal for Macs, but for productivity applications you definitely do want to plug in the mouse with a scroll wheel and a right click button. But with that, we have everything plugged in and set up, so how does this machine perform? Well, like I said, this has a PowerPC G4 processor and was the cheapest option that you could get a PowerPC G4 processor in. And to be honest, it performed pretty well, even this 1 GHz model. Applications like Adobe Photoshop and Illustrator work perfectly fine, and you can even do some pretty intensive video editing on this thing. I was even able to crank out 10 megapixel Photoshop files with this thing in a pretty fast speed, because in the 2000s this thing definitely was very fast, especially for the price. Because speaking of which, the education market is not the only group who noticed how affordable and nice these eMacs were. Because after they launched, the eMacs were highly popular among consumers, and Apple quickly opened sales to them. You could get a base model eMac for about $1,100, which is $100 more than educators paid for it, but it was still a pretty good deal nonetheless, considering that you'd be paying like $1,700 for a regular iMac G4. And it's no wonder these things were so popular among consumers, because for a lot of consumers, this was all they needed. They didn't necessarily need all the fancy tech that the G4 provided. And if you wanted a lot of power at home, especially back in the early 2000s, PowerPC was the way to go. This eMac initially shipped with OS X 3.3.3, but this eMac happens to have macOS 10 10.3.9. I did attempt to install macOS Tiger on this thing, but to be honest, I couldn't figure it out. And I also don't have another Mac on hand to make an install USB. But the main thing that upgrading to a slightly newer version of macOS for this thing does is add more app compatibility. For example, 10.4 Fox is a modern port of Firefox meant to work with PowerPC architecture, although recently development has been halted. And yeah, you definitely want to use a web browser like that because the newest version of Safari on this thing is from 2005 and hardly loads any web pages correctly. And that's also kind of the thing too, is that you probably don't want to be doing modern things on a PowerPC processor. These were fine things to do back in like 2014, but in 2021, it's not really a great idea. But I also think that these older processors are also what makes eMac so appealing, is because it also has a CRT display like I said, making it a prime candidate for retro gaming. Because being PowerPC, this is natively compatible with almost all macOS 9 software. And combined with this nice crisp CRT screen, you can get some really nice retro gaming done. For example, Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 4 runs pretty decently on these machines on medium settings. And games and applications and the entire operating system can run at the maximum resolution of 960p, but at that point the CRT does become kind of straining on the eyes, and I recommend keeping it at a resolution of 1024 by 768. And because it's a CRT, it kind of does its own natural anti-aliasing, it's just not super noticeable. And going back to productivity for a second, the CRT has excellent colors and brightness, and makes it a prime candidate for people who wanted to do Photoshop work. Because in the early 2000s, even Apple's own LCDs weren't all that color accurate. And in general, as long as you keep the refresh rate up and the resolution relatively medium, it's just really nice to look at. Ultimately though, in early 2006, Apple stopped selling these things altogether in favor of Intel Macs, which were much faster. But that does not mean at all that these eMacs became obsolete, because these were apparently used up until like 2013 in some schools. And these PowerPC eMacs did have a ridiculously long lifespan and were fairly reliable, save for a few issues with the CRT and hard drives. But Apple had repair programs for these things, and these machines were relatively easy to take apart and service if you really wanted to. And so really the longevity of these machines was only really limited by how long you wanted to use these machines. The only thing that's kind of unfortunate is that these days a lot of these eMacs just end up in e-waste, and since they have CRTs they're not easily recyclable, therefore adding to the e-waste problem. But despite this is still very special to computer to a lot of people. Heck, I had someone come up to me in class, no older than 18, saying that they've used an eMac before, sometime in like 2015. And that's a really rare phenomenon for a computer to be able to really transcend generations. These days though, despite the nostalgia that people might not even realize they have for these machines, they sort of just sit on shelves like this eMac was for the last 7 or 8 years. Which is unfortunate, but almost destined to happen with almost any computer. But yes, this is the eMac, an iconic and almost legendary computer in some ways. And truly one of a kind. This is Calc G, and I'll see you guys in the next one.